Good morning, everyone. I think this is a good moment to start. Welcome all. I am George Pavlakos. I'm a professor of law and philosophy at the University of Glasgow in Scotland, and I'm delighted to be chairing this morning's session. Our speaker of today's plenary is Professor Julie Sadaa, who is a professor of philosophy at the Sciences Po in Paris. Professor Sadaa's work spans an impressive range of topics, from the history and ethics of war, history and philosophy of international law, modern and contemporary political philosophy, to critical legal theory. Some of the titles of her books are Just War, Unjust War from 2009, International Criminal Justice and Mass Crimes from 2014, On Toleration from 1999, Hobbes, Spinoza and the Politics of Scripture, 2009, Hobbes and the Subject of Law from there's no date, Caring About the Law, and from 2010, and Law Between Theory and Critique from 2016. Her work has found resonance across the world, as is illustrated by the many visiting appointments she has received across the world. Among them, in Argentina, in Uruguay, in the United States, Finland, Tunisia, Algeria, Israel, Brazil, and Lebanon. The lecture she will be delivering today is entitled Three Dialectics of Human Rights. Please join me to welcome Professor Sadaa.
Thank you for your introduction. I first want to thank the IVR for inviting me to the Congress, so it's a great honor to be here. And thank you to Jin Sok-Kyung for the organization of the event. So the title of my presentation is, as you just said, Three Dialectics of Human Rights. And to begin, I'd like to say that human rights are commonly seen as supreme values, perhaps at the last utopia, to borrow the term from Samuel Moyn, but they are also sharply criticized. Sorry, there's a problem with my screen. So on the one hand, the utopian vision makes human rights the language of political legitimacy and a cosmopolitical ideal. And this ideal seems to be coming closer as regional and international human rights institutions, as well as institutional international criminal justice, are developing. On the other hand, the critical or disenchanted perspective sees human rights as an instrument of a new imperialism of neoliberalism, or it points out the multiple violations of human rights worldwide and their ineffectiveness. And they are contested for these reasons. I would like to show that some of these criticisms are rooted in contradictions inherent to human rights. For those who support human rights, these rights are often seen as forming unity and coherence. We speak of a system of human rights. The rights proclaimed during the French and American revolutions have been followed by the 1948 Declaration, then the 1976 Covenants, and finally, a set of international conventions and institutions aiming to guarantee these rights and international criminal law. From a philosophical perspective, I argue that there is coherence in human rights, particularly between civil and political rights on the one side and economic and social rights on the other. However, I also want to show that this coherence can only be maintained if we consider the complexities and contradictions that run through human rights. I could have titled my presentation, Three Contradictions of Human Rights, but I also want to adopt a normative philosophical approach to overcome these contradictions. That's why I will talk about dialectics of human rights. But dialectic is perhaps too Hegelian, a too Hegelian concept for my purpose, as the concept suggests that contradiction, so negation, is transcended in higher rationality, which would be too substantial and systematic to qualify my thesis. My position is to highlight the contradictions and propose a theoretical solution with practical consequences. So, what are the three paradoxes or contradictions that enable us to conceive three dialectics of human rights? Firstly, from an historical perspective, the rights of man and of the citizen were constructed against and by the political sovereign, against and with the modern transformations of sovereignty, against and with political power. This is what I call the dialectic of the initial creation of human rights. This dialectic has produced rights conceived as what I call a right to life beyond life, a right to a particular political condition. Secondly, human rights contain both a conception of individual freedom and a conception of collective freedom expressed in economic and social rights. This enables us to think of what I call the dialectic of the ongoing creation of human rights, and to consider human rights as defining particular political and social condition. Thirdly, and lastly, human rights are abstract and relatively indeterminate. This is a condition of their possible universalization. The contradiction here is that rights that define a right to life as a right to a specific political and social condition remain abstract, and moral rights that are disconnected from what individuals and communities can make of them. To become an effective right, a legally efficient right, a human right must be able to be claimed from specific institutions in determined contexts. These rights can become effective when they are transformed into specific rights. And this is what I call the dialectic of the universal and the local, showing how human rights rely on dignity. So my thesis is that rights must be conceived as claims we address to each other and protections we guarantee to each other. This relational dimension of rights must be considered through a capability approach which shows the interdependence of civil and political rights and socio-economic rights, the interplay between a universal perspective and a local one, and finally, which are derived from a twofold notion of dignity. So I start with the first part of my presentation, and in this first part, I would like to show that human rights have historically and intellectually been shaped according to what I call a dialectic of initial creation. This dialectic redefines the relationships between the individual and the state through rights that can be claimed against the state. Still, and paradoxically, the state also reinforced these rights when it became absolute. Before diving into this paradox, I want to clarify one point, since I begin with a genealogy of the rights that emerged during the French Revolution. I focus on Western, and specifically French, sources of human rights, while acknowledging that there are also non-Western sources of contemporary human rights. So I begin my historical perspective by analyzing the first process, that is the individualization of rights, which constitutes the major legal and political innovation of modern times. There is a debate about the sources of the rights of man and of the citizen. Some see the origins of individual rights in the transformations of medieval theology and their transposition into the legal sphere. They identify a movement from Duns Scotus and Occam to Suarez and Grotius. Others, such as Richard Tuck, show that individual rights arose from a transformation of the right of property derived from Roman law. However, whether we adopt one historiography or another, we see that natural rights became subjective rights by the early 17th century. Social contract theorists like Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau inherited this conception. They placed it at the foundation of their theory of the states, which they derive from the individual's will and natural rights. These philosophers contributed to the modern legal revolution by separating individual rights from natural law, identifying rights to freedom, and grounding the political association on subjective rights. I can't go into the detail, and I can do it during the discussion if you want. But what I want to highlight is that social contract theorists, such as Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, while having opposite conceptions of freedom, put freedom at the basis of the political association and ground it on individual rights. They defined a right to life beyond life, meaning that the political association is aimed at providing not only protection to life, but also a sphere of freedom where life is thought of as flourishing only in a political condition. These theories undeniably formed the intellectual substrate of the human rights proclaimed during the French Revolution. By defining a set of rights, the right to liberty, equality, property, and security, the revolutionaries achieved the process of transforming natural rights into individual rights. These rights specify what was thought of as a right to life, which is a right to live beyond mere biological existence, a right to live and live well, as Hobbes taught, a right to live in a political condition. However, this history of individual rights, conceived as opposable to the state, is paradoxical. For individual rights have also been produced by a transformation of political power, by the absolutization of the state in Western countries. That's what Max Weber observes when he analyzes how initially rights were possessed by groups only. In the Middle Ages, he says, individuals possessed rights that depended on their membership in communities based on birth, professional corporations, religious groups, and so on. And these rights depended on status that granted them privileges. Rights were neither equal nor unified. They formed a legal pluralism based on categories of people. As the modern state became absolute, it abolished these communities. The sovereign state consolidated and unified previously dispersed powers and communities, and it ended the heterogeneity of rights, becoming the sole source of rights and legislation. The advent of absolute sovereignty thus paradoxically reinforced the rise of individual rights, while making the individual entirely dependent on the state. So, what did the 18th century revolution do? What changed the declaration of these rights as the rights of the man and of the citizen? The French Revolution developed individual rights while partially detaching them from the state. these rights became the measure of political legitimacy and therefore opposable to the sovereign. In other words, the declaration reversed the movements that led the sovereign to produce rights and become the unique source of law into a movement that allowed these individual rights to be turned against the sovereign. Following John Locke's rights of resistance, rights became means of resistance to the unlimited power of the sovereign, which remains a potential source of oppression. Rights need the state to be guaranteed, and they can only persist through institutions while being opposable to the possible oppression of the state. And the paradox is that rights become dependent on the institutions that guarantee them, on the state that protects them, and opposable to the state, allowing citizens to limit it. So this is what I call the dialectic of the initial creation of rights. This dialectic leads us to think of rights with social contract theorists and the rights emerging from the revolution as rights to life and more than life, to borrow from Hobbes. They form a right to a particular political condition, a right to a free life, and equal freedom. So that was for the first dialectic. Now I would like to highlight a second dialectic of human rights. This is not a dialectic of the initial creation of rights, but one I call the dialectic of the ongoing creation of human rights. Its starting point is, once again, a contradiction. And this is a contradiction between two forms of freedom. From the 1789 Declaration onwards, and in subsequent declarations, we face indeed a contradiction between two concepts of freedom. On the one hand, civil and political rights seem to be based on individual autonomy, on the individual conceived as separated from others. On the other hand, social and economic rights refer to the concrete conditions of freedom, which presuppose economic redistribution and forms of social solidarity, thus viewing the individual as part of a collective. And I think this contradiction can be overcome if we consider the two groups of rights as interdependent. Let's go a little bit further into the details of these two conceptions of freedom. The first conception of freedom is contained in Article 4 of the 1789 French Declaration, which stipulates that, I quote, "Liberty consists in being able to do everything that does not harm others." Liberty here is conceived as non-interference. And it is this conception that Karl Marx criticizes when he notices that it perfectly fits with the protection of individual rights of property, meaning the rights of man are created to protect private property by subjugating the state to civil society, and more specifically to the bourgeoisie. The declaration then encapsulates a specific conception of rights based on the private sphere and selfish individualism. However, Marx neglects the rights based on collective freedom and action, such as freedom of expression and communication or the freedom of the press. The philosopher Claude Lefort points out, these rights enable the forming of a public reason and forms of political deliberation where individuals interact through speech and action. Furthermore, the 1793 Declaration includes socio-economic rights. For example, Article 21 states a right to subsistence, and Article 22 articulates a right to education. Thus, from the beginning, human rights have included a conception of freedom that includes both the material conditions of its effectiveness and collective forms of freedom. And these two types of freedom have been remaining until today in contemporary human rights. The 1948 Declaration defines civil and political rights in Article 1 to 21, including the right to liberty, security, legal personality, equal protection under the law, a fair trial, privacy, asylum, property, and so on. And the Declaration also defines economic and social rights in Article 22 to 26, such as the right to social security, work, fair wages, rest, an adequate standard of living, and education. These rights differ from civil and political rights as they require forms of social solidarity and economic redistribution, and they are entitlement rights corresponding to states' obligations towards their citizens. Therefore, we have two groups of rights, one corresponding to negative individual freedom, and the other to collective and material freedom. These two types of rights were later formulated in separate covenants. In 1966, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights was separated from the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, both adopted the same year. And we find this separation at the European level with the European Convention of Human Rights for Civil and Political Rights, which is separate from the European Social Charter. The same applies to the American Convention of Human Rights. It defines a set of civil and political rights, but does not include socioeconomic rights. This separation is surprising, as the preamble of the convention mentions an objective of social justice. However, socioeconomic rights are defined in a separate protocol, the Protocol of San Salvador. So what can we observe? We can see that the two groups of rights have been separated as they were developed. Civil and political rights seem independent from the material conditions required for their realization. They apparently rely on an individualistic view that reduces freedom to non-interference with others. And we have another conception of freedom that focuses on the social and economic conditions for these rights. Economic redistribution, entitlement rights, positive obligations of the state towards its citizens, and forms of social solidarity. I want to mention an essential element that seems to reinforce the contradiction between these two kinds of rights. Civil and political rights are immediately binding, and their violations can be sanctioned. In contrast, socioeconomic rights are to be achieved by state, I quote, to the maximum of their available resources with a view to achieving progressively the full realization of the rights. I quote the Article 2 of the 1966 Covenant. These rights are not fully binding, there are only objectives, so the two groups of rights are dissimilar and separate. If we turn now to the philosophical level, we find justifications for the separation of rights. Let me formulate 4 of them, and then I will reply to them. A first argument is that civil and political rights were formulated first historically, which would prove their fundamental character. A second argument asserts that these rights guarantee the integrity, autonomy, and dignity of the individual and the legitimacy of political institutions. Therefore, they form the conditions for life in society and constitute the political condition itself, prevailing over socioeconomic rights. A third argument is that socioeconomic rights entail taxation, and taxation should depend on sovereign state choices. They are a matter of sovereign choice for states, and governments should be free to consider, like Nozick, that taxation should be minimal. Therefore, socioeconomic human rights should not create binding obligations for states. A fourth and last argument states that the relative interdependence of rights must be understood in a specific way. That is, the dependence of socio-economic rights on civil and political rights. And here, the argument is that we can develop socio-economic rights by first protecting fundamental freedoms. The idea is that good institutions promote economic development, hence the realization of socio-economic rights. So these arguments hierarchize human rights. They assert that civil and political rights are paramount and the only rights that matter. But then, it's not surprising that some radical critiques of human rights are formulated. A widespread critique argues that human rights are neoliberal. For example, it's an example among others, but I think that that's interesting. So for example, Jessica White denounces the association of the universality of human rights with what she calls the morality of the market. She says that human rights movements, like NGOs, center on civil and political rights, on the protection against physical and political violence, but in doing so, they neglect another kind of widespread violence that results from the economic exploitation in the context of neoliberal globalization. Therefore, she says, human rights go along with neoliberalism and masks, so reinforces, its violent effects. So the separation of the two groups of human rights emerged both from international conventions and philosophical justifications. We see they can lead to a radical critique of human rights. And these arguments seem to uphold that rights are neither indivisible nor interdependent, that they do not have the same value, and therefore that they are hierarchized. They also oppose a concept of freedom, that of civil and political rights, so negative freedom, to another one, concrete freedom that involves forms of social solidarity and economic redistribution. How can we respond to these arguments? Firstly, the chronological arguments, so that civil and political rights appeared first historically, cannot establish a hierarchy between types of rights. The value of a right does not depend on its date of appearance. By the way, it's worth noting that socioeconomic rights emerge as early as 1793 and have been significantly developed since then. So the importance of socioeconomic rights was recognized since the beginning. Secondly, defining freedom without paying attention to its concrete conditions for individuals to enjoy it doesn't favor it. Dignity doesn't lie only in the possession of abstract freedom, but requires a dignified life, concrete conditions to enjoy freedom and make autonomous choices. So I will be more specific on this in a few minutes. Thirdly, we can respond to the argument that civil and political rights should prevail over socioeconomic ones because they are more fundamental and less costly. So that was the third argument I mentioned. This view takes for granted that civil and political rights are not demanding for the state. They define negative obligations, that is to say, to abstain from, while socioeconomic rights are more demanding. since they involve state action, redistribution policies, and more taxation. One can respond by saying that civil and political rights also include public spending. Protecting freedoms requires police, judges, a legal system, an administration, and so on. Civil and political rights are guaranteed because state establishes institutions, jurisdictions, administrations, and hence needs taxation, of course. From this perspective, the difference between civil and political and socio-economic rights should be nuanced. Fourthly, and lastly, it's easy, I think, to respond to the thesis that implementing civil and political rights is more fundamental because it conditions the economic development and the fulfillment of socio-economic rights. We observe that many wealthy countries adopt very marginal redistribution policies, leaving most of their population in poverty and unable to satisfy their socio-economic rights. The protection of freedoms alone is insufficient to guarantee the fulfillment of socio-economic rights. Therefore, I would like now to explain why we should support the interdependence of the two groups of human rights. And to begin, I'd like to define the notion of interdependence. I borrow James Nakel's definition. He says, interdependence of rights means that for one right to be realized, another right must also exist and be fulfilled. For example, the right to freedom requires the right to education to be fulfilled. Indeed, to be able to read and write helps to understand political issues, to take part in public deliberation, and fully exercise citizens' rights, including the right to vote and the possibility of influencing government's priorities. And it's the same with the right to decent wage or to adequate housing. People who are affected by economic exploitation, who don't have a sufficient wage or an adequate housing for a decent living, are less likely to participate in public debates, political decisions, and to exercise their citizens' rights. For these reasons, the interdependence and even indivisibility of rights are affirmed in international law, for example, in an UN resolution of 1950 or in the 1993 Vienna Declaration on Human Rights. And there are also philosophical arguments in favor of this interdependence. And I would like now to elaborate on through two notions, that of dignity and the conception of rights this interdependence presupposes. I begin with the notion of human dignity, which appears at the very beginning of the 1948 Declaration as the grounds of human rights. And I will develop it in a philosophical perspective. We can distinguish two meanings of the notion, two meanings at least. Firstly, dignity refers to a moral status, to the idea of an equal status of people. Hence, dignity involves equal moral rights. Dignity as moral status means that a set of rights is recognized for all human beings because of their capacities, regardless of their social situation, political affiliation, religion, gender, and so on. This conception isn't precisely based on human nature, which has faced much criticism. It's based on the idea of capacities and human needs to develop them. We can find a list of capacities, or I should say of capabilities, a list Martha Nussbaum has elaborated in the wake of Amartya Sen's work. She identifies 10 fundamental interests so the capabilities, life, bodily health, bodily integrity, senses associated with imagination and thought, emotions, practical reason, affiliation, other spaces, play, and control over one's environment. For Nussbaum, these basic capabilities meet the minimum required by human dignity. This seems a very broad conception, and it led to criticism. I leave them aside, and we can discuss it in the Q&A if you want. Let's consider for the moment that rights can be understood as claims made by individuals to develop their capacities and fulfill their needs. Therefore, rights meet fundamental needs and are related to the moral status of human beings, which defines dignity as a status. Secondly, so the second meaning, the second definition of dignity, dignity can also be understood as a condition. That is to say, the actual state in which one finds oneself regarding work, housing, education, and the contexts that either support or hinder the development of capacities. In short, dignity as a condition concerns living a dignified life. So we have two meanings of the concept of dignity, dignity as a status and dignity as a condition. These two meanings are complementary, but they do not necessarily coincide. Most of the time, they don't. When someone lives below the poverty line, lacks access to housing, education, healthcare, or is in a situation of slavery, for example, their dignity condition is not respected. They do not enjoy the conditions that allow them to realize their capacities because they do not enjoy their rights. However, they still have a dignity as a status. They are still entitled to the rights that would enable them to realize their dignity as a condition. Therefore, dignity as a status is independent of dignity as a condition, and dignity as a status can concretely be realized only through dignity as a condition. Dignity as a condition achieves dignity as a status. What's interesting here is, firstly, that the concept of dignity enables us to think of human rights as defining the relationship between a status and a condition. Secondly, that it leads to the idea of the interdependence of rights. Dignity as a condition implies the equal freedom of individuals and a set of means to achieve this freedom. That is to say, being educated, having basic needs met, and having the opportunities to develop one's capacity because the environment provides these opportunities. So I use here the term means when referring to economic and social rights, but this does not, this is not to introduce an instrumental relationship between the two types of rights or to hierarchize them. It's to emphasize that equal freedom is realized through a set of concrete conditions that involve not only the right to life in the legal sense, that is to say not being killed, enjoying bodily integrity, not being tortured, but also the right to a dignified life. This conveys a political and social condition enabling dignity as a status, as a moral right, to be realized as dignity as a condition. So I want to add that this conception of dignity and the interdependence of rights that follows presupposes a specific understanding of rights. Rights are not like things we possess individually. This understanding of rights is not false. It stems from their history, as I showed in the first part of my presentation. Historically, rights emerged from a process of individualization that led to the creation of individual natural rights. Here, rights were thought of as being possessed by an individual who was naturally free, isolated, and possessed individual and imprescriptible rights as a human being. From these individuals, political societies were thought to be created by the new union of individual wills in a social contract to protect these individual rights. And later, the Article 4 of the French Declaration defined liberty in the framework of the individual and private sphere, so that Marx's critique of rights could properly qualify it as selfish individualism, aiming at protecting private property for those who had any. It's not that this vision of rights is false or hasn't contributed to the emergence of human rights, quite the contrary. But I think it's partial. Individual rights are like a legal fiction created to oppose natural individual rights to the state, a vision that flourished during the French Revolution and was reinforced after World War II and the experience of totalitarianism. However, this doesn't mean that rights don't emerge from social interactions. Recognizing rights for individuals always means recognizing them mutually and reciprocally, and providing mutually and reciprocally the means to guarantee and protect them. I believe we should think of rights both as claims we make to each other and as protections we mutually grant each other. And I borrow this from Christian Hadot. Rights are mutual claims and protections. The consequence is that they cannot be conceived of as purely individual nor purely collective. Rights rely on relationships individuals have within a given collective. Therefore, we shouldn't think that the nature of rights lies in the fiction created by modern law. Because even when thought of as intimately linked to individuals, rights always presuppose social interactions, even a social ontology within which rights are recognized and mutually guaranteed. Consequently, we face a new paradigm that requires us to think of the relational nature of rights, and this on three levels. Firstly, the relationships between individuals. Rights are the form given to these relationships. Secondly, the relationship between dignity as a status and dignity as a condition. And thirdly, the relationships among rights themselves. This is the interdependence of rights. To conclude this part of my presentation, I would say that the dialectic of the ongoing creation of rights, the indefinite development of human rights, and the interdependence between different types of rights enable us to overcome the contradiction between the two forms of freedom in human rights declarations and conventions, the contradictions between negative formal or abstract freedom and concrete freedom. Dignity as a status requires all these rights, and dignity as a condition makes civil and political rights effective through the concrete form they take, thanks to socioeconomic rights. I believe that a coherent conception of human rights must affirm the interdependence between civil and political rights and socioeconomic rights, as freedom is inseparable from its material conditions of realization. It's what I name the dialectic of the ongoing creation of human rights. This dialectic develops the idea of a right to life beyond biological existence, understood as the right to a certain political condition, which also becomes a right to a certain social condition. Why do I speak of the ongoing dialectic of human rights? Why ongoing? Because the list of rights is always open. This is true from a legal perspective. Legal texts stipulate that the list of rights is open and that other rights will be added in the future. This, for example, allows for the developing of human environmental rights today. And it's also true from a philosophical perspective. Universal and abstract rights must be realized in specific and situated contexts where they are translated and implemented. And this leads me to formulate a third dialectic of human rights, the relationship between rights, universal and abstract nature, and the local contexts in which they have to be implemented. So now I come to the final part of my presentation, which will be brief due to time constraints. The third dialectic I want to highlight arises again from a contradiction in human rights. Human rights define rights that are stated in general, abstract manner. Even socioeconomic rights remain abstract. They do not specify the roles of governments or private actors in implementing them, nor do they detail what the right to healthcare concretely implies. They do not define labor roles, nor what constitutes a fair wage or which educational system should be developed. Thus, they are abstract rights. This might seem contradictory to the notion that they correlate with a conception of dignity defined as status and condition. However, this abstraction is necessary for their universalization, for states and different governments to adopt them. Imagine, for example, if human rights were stated specifically, like public policies or legislation. Which states would agree to them? Such rights would be criticized for lacking democratic legitimacy. They would be formulated without considering the different collective wills and different political communities. It could even be seen as contradicting people's right to self-determination, to freely choose the form of their political institutions and ensure their economic, social, and cultural development. And I refer to the Article 1 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Therefore, human rights must remain very general and abstract. Since I have little time left, I want to show that this universalization requires, in turn, a specific context-based translation of these abstract and general rights. In other words, rights must be both general or formally abstract and specific or concrete. We can call the first approach humanistic, and I borrow this term from Pablo Gilabert. Rights are so general and abstract that they are more likely moral rights than legal ones. The second approach can be named the specific political approach. Rights have to be translated into determined contexts within political collectives that create the conditions for their effectiveness. This is what I call the dialectic of the universal and the local. Human rights are abstract and general, while defining concrete conditions for rights to be achieved. But this contradiction is necessary because it is a condition for their possible universalization, that is to say, for their local translation. This dialectic raises new questions. How to translate abstract rights into specific rights? And how can we assess the implementation of specific rights? The capability approach to human rights combined with the two meanings of dignity seems relevant here. Dignity as a status relies on the idea that human beings have capacities they aim to develop. These capacities required rights as conditions for realizing these capacities by responding to fundamental needs and to what is required for the person to achieve what they consider valuable. The advantage of this approach is that it focuses on whether people can effectively use the goods and have access to the institutions and services they need. It defines freedom not in an abstract way, but by the capacities to act provided by our social, economic, political, and environmental context according to what we consider valuable. So I want to introduce a more subtle distinction. This is the last one. From the perspective of dignity as a status, people have rights that express valuable and morally justified needs as human beings, independently of their belonging to a specific political community. Human rights should then be understood as supporting people's capacities to do or to be what they want. From the perspective of dignity as a condition, rights refer to the actual possibilities to act. Hence, they must be implemented and concrete. They need to be adapted to local political contexts. This happens when human rights are implemented in domestic legal systems, translated into civil, political, economic, and social rights, into internal or domestic legislation. The contradiction between the universality of rights and their concrete effectiveness can be overcome when we consider human rights have to be translated into citizens' rights, and in order to make coincide dignity as a status and dignity as a condition. The contradiction is overcome when the two forms of dignity coincide. This rarely happens, given the extent of poverty and human rights violations worldwide. However, it gives us both a goal to strive for and a critical tool to evaluate human rights violations. This approach enables us to articulate civil and political rights with socio-economic rights, thus realizing the interdependence of rights. As Amartya Sen writes, socio-economic rights provide the freedom to act, to take possession of civil and political rights. Their interdependence and their capture through the capabilities of individuals resolve, in this sense, the contradiction between individual abstract freedom and concrete collective freedom. So to conclude my presentation now, I want to highlight a significant limitation, not much of my approach, but of human rights in general, even when understood through interdependence and capabilities. If human rights can be understood as rights to life beyond mere biological existence, that is, as rights to a dignified life, we need to assess their implementation in terms of capabilities which development is favored by specific legislation and public policies. While their abstract nature favors their possible universalization, their implementation requires them to be translated into specific concrete rights by different political communities. However, there is no guarantee that this translation will occur, and international constraints remain extremely limited. Human rights are generally considered minimal rights, quite far from a capability approach, which requires strong redistribution policies, forms of social solidarity, and a theory of equality that proceeds from a theory of justice. And a theory of justice is much more demanding than a theory of human rights. A conception of human rights as forming a right to a certain political condition, though that was my first dialectic, that implies a right to a certain social condition, second dialectic, enable us to think of the conditions of dignity, not necessarily the realization of principles of equality. However, it may not be the role of human rights to serve as a theory of justice. Their universalization, their acceptance by as many states as possible, presupposes limiting them to necessary but not sufficient conditions of justice. Their translation in specific political contexts remains the condition for their realization. Human rights form the necessary but insufficient conditions of a theory of justice. They can be required at the minimum standards of justice, not as a sufficient conception of justice. All in all, they are not enough. But who said they should be? They are the minimum, but not sufficient of a theory of justice that rests on human dignity. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much